speak. And cultures, memories and senses, and embodied methodology and pedagogy. Her research examines cultural memories of transnational migrant sex workers and explores decolonial ways to dememorialize histories of migration and sex work through performance ethnography. Saeyong Kim works with me at Asian Library. She is a Korean Studies and Dentistry Medicine reference librarian. She works at the Asian Library and Woodward Library at the University of British Columbia, and in her spare time, she's interested in children's literature and video games, and she's a fantastic storyteller, especially of children's stories. So if you ever have a chance to listen to her, I highly recommend it. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Shijin. I'm the head of Asian Library at the University of British Columbia. So I will pass it over to Dr. Yoshimizu.
Okay, thank you so much for introduction. So, yeah, thank you. And can you actually go to the next slide? Can you move to the next slide, please? Yeah. Okay. So today I'd like to talk about a Japanese feminist writer called Tamura Toshiko, and she goes by multiple pen names, but this is the most well-known name of the writer. I call her by her first name, Toshiko, because Tamura is her the family name of her first husband, Tamura Shogyo, and she kept changing her pen names after they are separated. So Toshiko is a well-known feminist writer from Japan, known primarily for her fictional writings published in Japan in early 20th century. So if you study Japanese literature, and particularly focusing on women's literature writings, you'd encounter this writer. But she also lived in Vancouver and was writing for working class women in Japanese Canadian community between 1918 and 1935. But the work she did in Canada is less known and less appreciated in Japan. And also because she was writing in Japanese, it hasn't been studied so much by English speaking scholars looking at Asian Canadian literature and history. I'd like to acknowledge that this presentation is based on a collaboration with Nakao Atsumi, which we undertook a few years ago. And Atsumi was interested in Toshiko's stories published in Japan, and I was interested in the work she did in Vancouver, so we collaborated and presented a paper together. And today I'd like to focus on her socialist feminist writings that she published in Japanese language newspaper in Vancouver, because it's one of few Japanese writings by women published in Vancouver from this time period. It reveals the tension that existed within Japanese Canadian community between men and women in a very explicit way. And with a closer look, it also reveals the ambivalent position that Japanese Canadian occupied as racialized settlers, to borrow Nico Yakashiro's words, in Canada at the time. And I'd like to note that at this point, this is one of my side projects, and I haven't been able to devote a lot of time doing this research. So my presentation is not really complete, but I'm hoping that this is going to be a starting point to look at Toshiko's work in Vancouver. Can you go to the next slide? But let me talk a little bit about Japanese language media in early 20th century Vancouver first. Next slide, please. So Japanese people started to migrate to North America in the late 19th century. So in 1901 in Canada, there were about 5,000 people from Japan, and this almost doubled 10 years later. And in 1941, there were above 23,000 people, including Canadian-born children. So with an increase of Japanese-speaking population, a number of daily, weekly, and monthly print publications for these people started to appear. And in Vancouver, there were the following daily papers, so including Kanada Shimpo, Tairiku Nippo, and Nikkan Meishu. So again, these are all daily publications, and there were other periodicals that were published less frequently and not included in this list. Next slide, please. So in Japanese migrant communities in early 20th century North America, Japanese language print media played very important roles. So these are political, economic, social, and cultural roles. They are an important source of information and knowledge, providing international and local news, including telegraph news from Japan and other parts of the world. They included lots of original stories that were specific to Japanese communities in North America and local issues that affected the lives and work of the immigrant population. It was also a provider of entertainment, a promoter of community businesses, and a site of social interactions. So they had large section devoted to advertisements of Japanese-owned businesses, reviews of Japanese-owned businesses, and even gossip. There are gossip sections. So if you look at the pictures, the upper right is there's a little section called dream reading. So the editor solicits stories about dreams, the dreams that you have while you sleep, from readers, and the editor interprets the dreams for them, the contributors. And the picture below says A Peek at Restaurants. So it's a series that provides Japanese restaurant reviews. And upper left is a logo for readers' comment section. In the bottom left is the voting results to determine the best businesses in Japanese community or best waitresses, so on and so forth. So just like other mainstream newspapers, it also had a function to discipline fellow people as well by showing good examples but punishing bad examples too by exposing, for example, crimes. Japanese newspapers were also a site of amateur literary practices for migrants who have limited access to mainstream publications due to cultural and linguistic differences and lack of resources. And they also included community updates. So this includes the birth of a child, funerals, prominent community members leaving Canada for good, so on and so forth. So Japanese language papers played very important roles in those days. And this became the venue for Toshiko to publish her writings when she moved to Vancouver. So Toshiko is an award-winning writer from Japan. Again, she's known for the fictional writings that she published before she left Japan. So she left Tokyo in 1918 for Vancouver. And when her partner passed away, she moved to Los Angeles, stayed there for a while, came back to Vancouver and left to Tokyo, went back to Tokyo. And finally, she actually moved to occupy Shanghai, and she ended her life in 1945 in Shanghai. So as I mentioned earlier, with some exceptions, such as works of Anne Sokolovsky, Japanese literary scholarship has not considered Tamura's work produced after her 1918 departure from Japan so seriously. In the meantime, she has not been widely known in North America, even among Japanese Canadian or Japanese American communities, partly because her work was published only in Japanese language, and she ultimately did not settle in North America. But the reason why she moved to Vancouver was because her new partner, Suzuki Etsu, who was a journalist, had moved to Vancouver to work for Tairiku Nippo. When Toshiko arrived in Vancouver in 1918, she immediately found herself isolated and alienated in her new sociocultural environment. She was now in a foreign country, away from the vibrant Japanese literary scene back home. And in addition, while Toshiko was from a prestigious rice broker family in metropole Tokyo, the early Japanese migrant community consisted disproportionately of a large group of working class men from rural Japan. And women had begun to be more visible as early as 1908 when they started to migrate to Canada through marriage. So by joining their husbands who had already been living and working in Canada. But the community was still male dominant when Toshiko arrived in Vancouver. According to Audrey Kobayashi, who studied the experiences of Japanese women in early 20th century Canada, the majority of Issei women, or first generation immigrant women from Japan, worked in a variety of menial and usually demeaning occupations to support their husbands. Despite the great contribution they made through their labor, however, women's work was viewed as an evil necessity because it was considered antithetical to proper raising of children and to the Japanese ideology of good wives, wise mothers, that was becoming dominant back in Japan. And this community of Issei women became Toshiko's target reader. So soon after she arrived in Vancouver, Toshiko found her literary venue in Tairiku Nippo and started to publish short stories, poetries, essays, and opinion pieces under her new pen name, Torinoko, a bird child. Nippo to Toshiko became a new place for literary expressions and a site to formulate her new identity as a socialist feminist writer. She also turned it into a place for building a new community of Japanese women in Vancouver. And this is evident in her Saturday Women's Column series. So that was first published on August 2nd, 1919, and continues weekly until August 30th, and then skips a week. And the last installment is published on was published on September 13th, 1919. And the last one ends with a note to be continued, but I couldn't find the following installments in the subsequent issues. So the series ended rather abruptly. The first installment is specifically addressed to Japanese women living in this city, which is remarkable given that the newspaper's writers and readers are both predominantly men. And furthermore, she soon starts to identify her readers as women who work, oppressed class of women, and fighters against the patriarchy who could potentially awaken women back in Japan. So she's definitely an interesting figure, empowering figure, but her positionality and relationship with her audience makes her work ambivalent. So she comes from an upper middle class family in Tokyo, which was the capital of Japanese empire, and was writing for working class women from rural Japan with an intention to enlighten them. So there are some gaps between Toshiko and her readers based on class and educational background. And as I'll show you later, her language also reflects her settler mindset. So her work should be evaluated critically as well. And again, I'm going to come back to this later, but before she died in Shanghai, she published Chinese language journal, New Shen, Women's Voice, as the editor advocating for universal sisterhood. But this magazine was subsidized by Japanese imperial authorities. I'll come back to this later. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show you some excerpts from Saturday Women's Column. So this is from the second installment of the series. So it goes, Two Women Who Work, from Torinoko, Bird Child. Today, I'd like to speak to women in Vancouver who have a job and work outside home or work inside home to assist husband's business with strong commitment. You think you must work and accumulate wealth. You devote efforts to prosper in your own occupation. You think you must cooperate with your husband to expand his business. You envision returning to Japan having all aspects of your life accomplished. You worry about children's education to the extent that is unimaginable to those in Japan. Next slide, please. At the same time, you are not a puppet that is forced and manipulated by others, but living women who are self-aware and determined to work. Leave for a moment aside your passion to pursue material wealth or desire to return to your homeland as a successful family. Try instead to examine the world broadly, think widely, and pay attention to your surroundings. This means nothing but gaining new knowledge, and this is our first step toward self-cultivation. Next slide, please. You can start, however, in small. Cultivating 1 acre of field does not qualitatively differ from cultivating 3 acres of field. Every person cultivates their own path and walks through it as they discover what is unique to themselves. One person may find a yellow flower and another may find a white flower. That becomes their thought and vision of life and will ultimately give birth to new women's scream. The scream that awakens sleeping women in Japan who are hindered by hackneyed ideas and buried in the domestic space and transforms their thinking. Those of us abroad must realize our single most important task of acquiring new knowledge. Next slide, please. And so this is from later installment of the series, and it goes, One's Rights, from Torinoko. You demand your rights when they are violated or ignored. If others treat you with respect and compassion on equal grounds, why would you need to demand your rights? The tragic realization that are the same human being occurs among the lower classes that are always oppressed and persecuted. Among those underclasses is the class of women. So you can see a classic socialist feminist narrative here, But if you look at other parts of the series, you also notice that it's combined with a critique of Japanese style of patriarchy shaped by Confucian norms. So in her September 13th installment, she critiques this idea that in their lifetime, Japanese women must submit first to their parents, and then their husband, and finally their children, especially their sons. And she challenges that idea. And you can also see a critique of labor migrant values. So there's an idea that Japanese women are here to as a temporary labor migrants who are supposed to accumulate wealth and bring it back home. And she cautions against this idea and encourages women to bring new knowledge back home to awaken women. And in another installment, she also expresses a concern over these Japanese women recently arriving from Japan whose fashion is over the top. And she links this to Japan's capitalist growth and critiques the materialistic desire that new coming migrants had. But again, her writing contains a settler worldview. So her use of words such as cultivate or discover sort of signal the view that they live in this new empty land and they are working towards self-realization or self-cultivation, and there's no awareness that this is little awareness that this is an indigenous land stolen from indigenous peoples. Next. So this is actually the last slide, and I'd like to briefly touch on what she did after she stopped writing for Tairiku Nippo. In May 1920, the first cross-racial alliance and labor strike was organized by white, Chinese, and Japanese workers. And this motivated the Japanese migrant community to educate and organize Japanese workers for effective class struggles in the future. In response to the felt demand, Toshiko's partner, Suzuki Etsu, left Nippo and started publishing Rodo Shuho, or Labor Weekly, which in 1924 turned daily with a new title, new name, Nikkan Minshu, or Daily People. And it continued publication until late 1941, immediately before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, which led to the forceful removal and internment of Japanese Canadian community. So Toshiko started writing for Minshu in October 1924 and became responsible specifically for the women's section. And in the 1930s, Toshiko and Japanese women workers established labor union, of which Toshiko became the leader, and she worked together with white women workers in leading local activism. And again, she eventually goes back to Japan and moved to Shanghai. And in Shanghai, Toshiko went by her maiden name, Sato Toshiko, first, and got involved in the publication of a women's magazine, New Shen, Women's Voice, as the editor, with her Chinese pen name, Sashun Shiba, which is actually a Japanese way of reading that name. And she was working with her assistant, Guan Lu, who was an underground member of the Chinese Communist Party. The magazine focused on raising awareness about gender issues and gender oppression, but the evaluation of New Shen's role in emancipating Chinese women needs to be, of course, evaluated carefully. So that magazine was published in Occupy Shanghai from a Japanese publisher. So the magazine promoted Japanese language education and culture, including this imperialist idea of the Great East Asia Prosperity Sphere, which is euphemism for Japanese empire. And in this magazine, Toshiko strongly believed in the universality of women's issues across racial lines, sort of extending her experience of cross-racial alliance in Canada. But what is lacking, perhaps, in her advocacy of transnational solidarity among women is a serious analysis of her own participation in the colonial processes, both in Canada and China, that produce racial hierarchies and displaced and dispossessed indigenous peoples and colonized indigenous lands. So just to wrap up, Tamura's Saturday Women's column marks a turning point in Tamura's or Toshiko's writing. This is when her writings became much more political, addressing class struggles and racial tension that existed in Vancouver, in addition to gender issues. And I couldn't really talk about racial parts in this presentation, but in the first installment, she mentions that Japanese migrants would not feel at home in Vancouver because the land is occupied. She uses the term occupied by other races. So, and This series is also when her politics gains a transnational dimension, also foreshadows her later works to build close racial alliances in North America and Asia. So I'm gonna stop here. Thank you.
Oh, are we moving straight on?
Okay.
Slides, please. And I will position myself like this. Sorry to have my back to you. I'm going to talk about creative expression under oppression, and it's going to be in roughly the same period, I think, as yours, which is fortuitous. Next slide, please. What I'm going to be talking about is a series of poets, like who are have reacted differently, and it has either been reflected or not reflected in their own works to institutional oppression or government oppression, organizational oppression. This is Chun Sang-byung, and he is a very happy guy, as you can see from his picture. He writes about things like, oh, I love my mother-in-law, children are beautiful, it's awesome that light exists, because if there were no light, we would just all be in the dark. So as you can see, even from the quote over here, that is his most famous work. I will return to the sky. All of the translations in this presentation are my own humble work, and so you must forgive me if they're not very graceful. But I will return to the sky. The day my picnic to this beautiful world ends, I will go and I will say or tell them that it was beautiful. So as you can see, he's got very simple, very direct language. His worldview is considered pure, innocent, childlike, naive. I just want you to note the year. It's 1970. And next slide, please. The very next year, he has a different poem that is noticeably darker. And for this one, I want to read the Korean quote first because the language I think is important. 이제 몇 년이었던가 아이론 및 와이셔츠 같이 당한 그날은 내 살과 뼈는 알고 있다. 진실과 고통 그 어느 쪽이 강자인가를. And the humble translation. When was it now? Years ago, I was flattened as helplessly as a shirt under a hot iron. My flesh and bones know which is stronger, truth or agony. This is from 1971. And it was this impressive ambiguity. He doesn't say in the poem or ever afterwards which is stronger, truth or pain. That got me interested in looking up this poet. He's the kind of guy that generally people know the way in English you know Robert Frost. You're like, who's Robert Frost? And people go, the road that, you know, like you take the one that's less taken and it changes your life, or like the woods are lovely, what dark and deep, but I have promises to keep. That kind of guy. So everyone knows his Kwichon, the happy one, the picnic one, but this one is a little bit less well known. It's not that something horrible happened in 1970 to 1971. Something happened to him in 1967. He was taken away on trumped up anti-communist charges. So he was well known for cadging meals and drinks off of his friends and laughing about it later. One of those friends was caught up in what was known as the East Berlin affair, where people were accused of communicating with North Korea and being communists. He was taken away and he was tortured, and he was not heard from for 6 months. And when he returned, he weighed 40 kilograms and had bad teeth, and he could not recognize his friends, and he was never able to have children again due to the torture. Next slide, please. So if you think of the time period, 1967, and then in 1970, there's that happy poem, and then 1971 is when he finally talks about truth and pain. It really is incredibly fascinating. And so let's talk about the curse, may you live in interesting times, which is the background that you have to know, like why all of these things happen in Korea and why the poets are all crazy and all of the twisty turns that happen there. within the 80-year period roughly between 1910 and let's pretend like early 1990s, all of this happens. So Korea is annexed by Imperial Japan in 1910 and lives as a as a colony, an imperial colony until 1945, where they participate in World War II as Japanese subjects, if lowlier subjects. There's also forced labor and stuff like that. Then after 1945, there isn't independence directly. The United States and the Soviet Union separately sponsor Korea because the peninsula is at a strategically important point between China and Japan, of course. And so there is an arbitrary divide at the 38th parallel. They just took a ruler and go like that. And so it's Soviet Union, North Korea, United States, South Korea. At this time, the border, or such that it is quite fluid, and people just go back and forth, and they don't take it very seriously because they consider that afterwards, like they'll leave the sponsorship and it will be one country once again. But in 1950, there's the Korean War, where North Korea invades South Korea. There is a huge loss of life. There is incredible loss of not loss. There is trauma to the cultural psyche. Let's put it that way. And there is a huge paranoia, at least from down south, towards communism. So it becomes something more than the anti-communist fever in other places, even than say the United States. And the border is not free anymore. It becomes an impassable border, and it stays that way to this day, where there are soldiers on each side with, there's a demilitarized zone. You cannot pass. So there are several families, innumerable families that are torn apart and no longer able to meet their family members. So there's that whole trauma. And in the meantime, there is a dictator. This dictator is the one that, from this point, I'm talking just about South Korea because who knows what's happening in North Korea? I do not know. The dictatorship goes on for decades. There's a student protest. The dictator goes to Hawaii, of all places. There's a military coup d'etat. This guy turns out to be another dictator. There are protests against his rule, and then he gets assassinated. There's another military coup d'etat. He's also a dictator. There's mass protests, citizen protests, and this time it ends in civilian massacre. And then he has to step down. There is, depending on how you interpret it, there's another dictator, or this one is a democratically elected president. I'm not going to talk about like how to interpret that because, yeah, it all ends in 1993, or it ends or something else changes with the first civilian president. That's like the very, very quick history of Korea, and I've taken more time than I ought. So let's move on to the next slide. And I think that oppression is something that happens with regulations and with pretty much law and order, because if it's like a war period or a turbulent period, what happens is violence. You get killed, you get taken away. But oppression is when there are rules and meetings and people can watch you in your everyday life and control you. That's when your creative expression really um, gets controlled, or people attempt to control it. And for the sake of nope, sorry, I didn't mean for you to skip that slide. For the sake of discussion, I'll only talk about the Japanese colonial rule period, because the period after that is still too close. It is quite contested, like what is oppression and whether it was oppression, all of that stuff. And we do not need to talk about that stuff. So let's go back to the next poet. This person is an example of resistance, where he was very young. He was a student. He went to Japan, where he and his cousin were preparing to educate themselves in order to bring back that knowledge and start some like resistance activities. All of these were just plans, though, because he was taken to prison very quickly and he died there. So nothing came to fruit, but he is considered a very strong resistance poet. His poems don't actually reflect that. They are full of introspection and like how a man should live and whether or not I have shame in my heart and stuff like that. And this is the most like overt poem I think that he has, where he's talking about something that might be construed as something in his real life that would become a resistance, stretching out his neck to shed blood that blooms like flowers under a darkening sky. Next slide, please. This man is the man who wrote the introduction to the book of poems of the past poet Yun Dongju. Actually, let's let's wind that back a bit. Yoon Dong-ju's poems were never published in his lifetime. He did not think that his poems would be published in Japan or under imperial rule. So he wrote 3 copies of his manuscript, and he kept 1 copy and he gave a copy each to his friends. And after he died, the other 2 copies were lost. But one of his friends met this man, Chung Jiong, who was already a well-established poet. You'll see that the quotes I have from him are 1927, 1932. He was already pretty established during the imperial period. He was a famous poet. The friend brought the manuscript to this man, and he published them posthumously. And so Yoon Dong-ju's work is 1 single book of poetry. That's his only work. Chung Ji-young was very proud of publishing those works because Chung Ji-young was he was, like I keep saying, he was very well established, and he's an awesome poet in that the quote that I have for him there, it's called Nostalgia, the top one, there ever in dreams unforgotten. It's broken like that, and it has those commas there because in Korean, it's a single sentence, 4 words, 그곳이 차마 꿈엔들 이칠리야. And I could not translate it. No Korean, I challenge any Korean to translate it in a way that it sounds exactly as heartrending and as close to your everything as that sentence is, but very, very broken. It is that. Never in my dreams will I forget that place. And it's a lost place, but it's also home. And I wanted to contrast that with the second quote, which is that he has in fact come home. I've come home. Home, it's said twice. It's not the home I've been longing for. So you can see that he's always talking about home and what it means and like the nostalgia. And also possibly he's not as happy as he used to be. He was under pressure to create works that are cooperative towards the Japanese imperial rule, is what people think. They do not know because he never wrote works that could be interpreted as collaborating with the Japanese except for one. There's one ambiguous poem in 1941 that is a string of beautiful expressions that together don't make much sense. They're kind of meaningless. You could kind of interpret them as ambiguously saying that the imperial rule is good, but that's it. It's really very, very ambiguous. And then he stops writing poetry. So after 1941, he never writes poetry again. He simply doesn't write until 1945 when Korea gains independence. After that, he writes prose, like essays and political writing and stuff like that. Never writes poetry. So people kind of interpret that as possibly the magazine, which is known to have been a pro-Japanese magazine that published his last ambiguous poem, was exerting pressure on him to do so. And having capitulated, he no longer wanted to write and considered himself not a poet anymore. All of this is conjecture, but that's what people think. And so the next slide, please. So that would have been resistance, and the other thing is silence in protest. Or in Korean, we say that you broke your pen. Not writing anymore. This guy is Seo Jung-ju. And you'll notice he doesn't have a quote, but he has an interesting, well, that is a quote. It's not a poem, but Tatsushiro Shizuo. He went peacefully from power to power, writing beautiful, qualitatively less good as time went by, but beautiful poetry about every single political person who came into power. And when he wrote about like the Japanese, he said like the emperor was good. When he wrote about the military dictator, he said he was like awesome. And from dictator to dictator, that's what he did. When someone asked him after the end of World War II, when people were trying to, it's a mess in Korea because of all of the turbulence that you remember, there wasn't as clear-cut a trial of people who were Japanese collaborators after the war ended because they were the best educated people and they were the elite class. So some of them kind of ended up becoming the government class after liberation because there was nobody else to do that work. So it became complicated when you tried to balance, now we must all of us like survive and have a thriving economy and all of that stuff, against now how are we going to talk about our past and kind of get that out of the way. But there was some conversation. And this one, I don't have an actual quote for it because it is very well quoted in like many newspapers of the time and stuff like that, but I can't track it down to a transcript or an actual record of where the first, like where it first appears. So it's just there. But apparently this is what he said when someone said, why did you collaborate with the Japanese? He said, I didn't know they would lose the war. And the second thing he says after that was, I thought they would stay in power for hundreds of years. So that's, I'm not going to quote from him. He lived very well. The next person though is Cho Ji-hoon, who is, he's, oh, I made a typo, not 1998. He, oh dear, I think it's 19, oh no, 58? No, possibly. Oh gosh, I will look that up in a sec. I will do a phone thing and be like very sorry. I can't believe I missed that. I looked at these slides like tens of times. But anyway, um, one of his most famous things is he wrote beautiful poetry that utilized the Korean language as well, and like his imagery is generally of things like Korean dancing or of Korean folk tales. So very local, indigenous, if you can use that word in a Korean context. Anyway, one of his famous works is called like On Principles. It's either On Principles, On Integrity, or On Willpower, Chijo. He writes, to preserve one's integrity is exceedingly difficult. Without commitment to risking one's life, to protesting corruption and unjust powers, to undergoing the worst humiliations and suffering the lowest of livelihoods, one should not dare to speak of integrity. And I think this quote kind of pulls everything together because all of the people who resisted the different kinds of oppression that they had did, like I have not quoted several other poets here who, like, some of them died in prison, and those were the people who we always think of as like they're strong resistors and things like that. But there are many more nameless people who simply were poor. They just were poor, and it doesn't show up in history if you're just poor and then you can't make a living as a writer. That's almost invisible, right? We don't even remember them because their works were not published. So how can we remember them? But that is the price of being a principled person. And I was going to do like some slide foo, but we'll leave the slides here and talk about this guy, Cho Ji-hoon, and the sellout guy before, who lived very peacefully. There's an interesting story about those two because they have an acquaintance in common. So sellout guy was married to someone whose sister was also married to a man called Kim Kwan-sik, who was known as a very blunt and outspoken poet who was very he was a young man without respect. That's how it was considered. And so when it's the new year, everyone has to go and say hello and happy new year, and you generally go to your relatives first. So because sellout guy was brother-in-law of this poet Kim Wan-sik, he should have gone first to him because he's a respected poet colleague and again also like a much older brother-in-law. He did not come until the late afternoon, and when he came, he was drunk. So of course Ayaka is very angry, and he's like, how can you disrespect me like this? And what he says was, well, considering like your moral fiber, I thought it made more sense to go say hello to Master Cho Ji-hoon first, like as a poet, as a guy, and like, whew, sick burn. And our connection to our Cheonsangbyung poet in the beginning is, if you can show me the next slide, please. That blunt guy, like sick burn guy, and Chun Sang-byung were best friends, drinking buddies. They both died of liver troubles, bless their hearts. And so the story comes full circle. Next slide, please. I just want to go back to thinking about that truth or agony. It's left ambiguous whether truth or agony is stronger, but all of these pictures are memorials to Chun Sang-byung. They all have the words of his poem, his famous poem, carved over them. They're in all the places that were important to him, like where his house was, where he first published, where his school was. So I guess that's something. Thank you.
Thank you both. So we have we have some time for questions. I'm going to give a little bit of a pause so that everybody has some space for it.
I have a question.
Okay.
If
Sarah
nobody else has a
first.
question,
Okay.
I have a question. I noticed from the presentation that when she writes Toshiko,
Mm.
there's often mention of going back to Japan, and she also writes like to the people here who are the Issei women that you will wake up the women in Japan. So was there a strong feeling that everyone will either go back or that there's always a connection to the home country?
Yeah, I think when the first generation immigrants came to Canada, the assumption was that mostly, right, they eventually go back to Japan, and they, you know, ultimately many of them. I mean, they were deported back to in the context of Second World War, right, by Canadian government. But otherwise, they, you know, as yeah, I mean, a little bit going back. So Japanese immigrants, their first disproportionately men to their bachelor, working class men came to Canada for work, and their intention was to go back to Japan.
Okay.
And then there was, you know, immigration policy changed. There was a after Hayashi Demure agreement was made. There was a quota for Japanese people to enter Canada, and the yearly quota was 400 people. But women were able to immigrate, so they started to sponsor women from Japan through this system called Picture Bride system. So they would find wives in Japan. They just, you know, maybe on paper, and then women, you know, join their husbands. In most cases, they never met
So
their
again,
husbands.
400, right? Because there's 400 men.
400 was quota imposed on men.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
Technically, it should be 400 to 400.
Oh no, so if you're a man and you already, you know, in Canada, you are able to sponsor women. You know, your
More
wife.
than one?
No, just one.
Okay, yeah.
Just one.
Okay.
Yeah. um, and so they started, like, a family started to grow, and then, you know, eventually many people actually settled down. Yeah. So your question was whether, yeah. So I think at this time when Toshiko was writing for Japanese women, I think the assumption still was that they eventually go back. You know, they bring the wealth back home.
Mhm.
Mm. But you might know better. Some of the audience members might know better about this. Yeah. I have a question for you too.
Yes.
I'm wondering if the poets that you introduced today are actually, to what extent they are known back in, you know, Korea, I mean, in Korea, and whether their works are taught in school, for instance.
Mm. I can answer this from a place of beautiful ignorance, in that my knowledge of poets and poetry is like the most general of general. These are all people who I learned in like elementary, middle, high school. So they're all in textbooks, is what I can say. So they're that well known. But your question, the second question, are they taught nowadays?
Mm.
I would have to ask my much younger cousins, right? Um, I don't know. I kind of think that Sellout Guy is probably less taught, but there was something that I missed from the presentation that I couldn't say, which is that because he sold out so extensively, he was supported by every government he was at. So he's got a lot more works, like way more works than anybody else has. And because he also had talents, um, unfortunately, he was a very talented guy. So his works are of uniformly excellent quality.
Mm.
So he has a huge impact on the Korean literary scene and literary history. And he also had hordes of like the blunt poet who was like, I'm not gonna say hi to you first. Anyway, they were related, and also he was like a patron, right? He taught hordes of other like younger poets and was a mentor and was like a guy you couldn't not you couldn't ignore in the scene. So he is, I think, at in the middle of like several kinds of discussions of whether literary merit has an ethical aspect to it, I think, right now. What I can say about like Yun Dongju, the guy who you saw first, the one who died very young in prison, his works are almost always part of like the national exams, like the ones that like you go for. That guy and the one who came after him, um, Chong. My Korean and my English are not working together today. Jung Ji-young, there we go. Yoon Dong-ju, Jung Ji-young, Lee Yuk-sa, and maybe Bang Mo-wol. So there's a handful of people. Any of the names that I know are generally names that come out in like the national exams. You're expected to know them as a Korean, even if it's just like a I have promises to keep kind of way.
Okay. Claire.
Thank you both for incredible presentations, and I couldn't help but thinking during them how necessary that role of using language to speak out against oppression still is today. And I was wondering if you could speak to any kind of like similar roles you see either for writers or other people, other professions, to have that kind of radical liberatory role in our societies. And then I do have a follow-up, but I wanted to get that one out first.
So the question about, just for the audience who's not here, so the question about whether there are similar roles for people who are going against oppression.
Either like people that individuals that you can think of, like, oh, this reminds me of this historic figure, or more broadly, like the role that writing still plays today, or maybe it's changed into like influencer or
So the role that writers or potentially influencers have had today in terms of words and
context, in a similar transnational context, or
yes.
I'm not a literary scholar. This is an excuse. I can't.
I'm going to say I'm not even a scholar. I'm a librarian.
I mean, nowadays there's some very interesting examples coming up in Japanese literary scene where Taiwanese author writing in Japanese and winning Japanese literary award. And I can't remember the name. You can look it up because this is very recent, like in the past few years. So it's interesting to think about what is Japanese literature, right? Who is considered as Japanese, like, writers? Like, how do you define Japanese, right? By language or by authors' identities? And I think that, I think the traditional notion of Japanese literature has been really shaken up. Recently it's becoming more, I think, interesting question because of this emergence of diasporic writers. But I think in the past, if you look closely, right, or carefully, there were examples like that. Even Tamura Toshiko herself, she was, of course, publishing in Japan. She was a Japanese person. She's ethnically Japanese, but she also moved around. And again, like her work, outside of Japan hasn't really considered as part of Japanese literature. So, yeah, I'm not answering your question, but yeah.
And you said, did you have a follow-up? Or
I did, unless you have anything to say.
Yes, things to say. I always have things to say. They're not always good things to say. But before I say that, I quickly Googled, and the guy who I was like, he can't have been born in 1998. Of course not. He was born in 1902. There we go. So who knows why that went there, but that's okay. So about the role of literature, or of writing, I actually kind of want to go and not even talk about influencers, but talk about publishers, because I feel like that is one of the main things. Like Toshiko, she was able to write those things, like you said, like, towards female workers and call them female like fighters, but in a newspaper that you said was written for and mainly read by like male workers. So that would have been an editorial choice, or like the publisher's choice. And many of the people who were like oppressed in that presentation, the form of oppression is usually like this: they can't get published because either if you publish them, your newspaper or your magazine will be shut down, or the newspaper or magazine simply will not accept your work. And then word gets around among all of the like editors and publishers. And of course, this is a time when people are publishing like only on paper. But word gets around, and then what? It doesn't matter if you have like hundreds of poems, you can't get published. So I think that that's different now because you can very easily get there's self-publishing is a thing. You can get printed. There's the internet. I guess you could say that's becoming an influencer, but um, like I think Rupi Kaur, was it? Like, wasn't she? Didn't she start off like Instagram? I think so. There are ways, and I think that it's important to have your words go up. Follow-up question.
So my follow-up, after I wrote that out, I had to write out questions, but I was thinking then about your opening statement and in the land acknowledgement, the role of linguistic diversity itself in having that anti-oppressive power in today's culture, and maybe also your experiences working with Japanese and Korean materials, and then trying to translate scholarship or presentation in English, and bringing those forward from the archives or their house.
So just to reflect on that, so asking to reflect on having to translate and to think about these Japanese and Korean works in English and how that relates to linguistic diversity and oppressive power.
Are we talking about translation?
I would love that. Sounds great. Yeah.
Again, I'm not sure if I'm gonna respond to your question directly, but I'm recently interested in the indigenous languages in Japan too. So there are Ainu people, Okinawan people. They had very distinct languages, and yeah, I'm reading Ainu literature a little bit, and their primary language is actually Japanese, but they also sometimes insert Ainu words in the literature, and I found that's really, really impactful to encounter. But it's interesting to think about how to translate that into English, right? Like those linguistic diversity. It's really difficult to do that in English, right? So I mean, when you translate it, so yeah, I mean, your question kind of makes me wonder about what are good strategies to retain that diversity when you translate things like that.
Any thoughts there?
On translation, how much time do we have?
We've got just under 10 minutes.
Okay. About translation itself, I mean, there's a whole like area in translation theory, right, where people who like are active translators will like have it out about like when there's like your language, like the mother language or the original language, and then there's a target language that you're translating into. The translator stands here and does something in between to the language. Should you stand closer to here? So, like, for instance, if I were translating, like, you saw a couple of translations of poetry from me from Korean into English, and some of them were kind of smooth, and some of the, like, the one about home was really choppy. And that, all of those were choices. Like, how do you convey, like, this language and this way of thinking and this way of feeling is different from your North American way of thinking and talking and being? Do I emphasize that so you feel the alienness even though the language is one that you know? Or should I um, localize it really well so that you feel the same things that that a Korean reader would feel if they were reading it in Korean? Those are all choices, and there have been, I think, some discussions about like whether or not you should have words italicized, like when they are like different vocabulary, right? And that's a common practice, I think. But like, what does it mean? It's kind of a signal that, yeah, it's okay, it's not a typo, you're supposed to not know this word, but it's also a, this is very different and you're not supposed to be familiar with this word kind of thing. So again, like, it's always shrugs. I saw you.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes, so go for it.
I just wanted to go back
and we talked about, you know, how she's trying to get the women to bring this like political awareness back to Japan. I'm curious, is she citing like Western feminism, like Canadian American first wave feminism, as a way, as a reason that they're doing this, or is it coming from somewhere else? Like, why is it that the women in Canada are going to be doing this for the women in Japan?
And so the question is about whether Toshiko's kind of drawing on Canadian American feminism, first wave, second wave feminism, in terms of how she's relating to women in her writing.
I don't know because she doesn't explicitly cite anything, right, in her writing. But it's possible. I mean, if you look at what she did later, she's, directly working with white and Chinese, women workers to lead the activism locally. So maybe from this point already, she had contact with, maybe white feminists. Suzuki Etsu, her partner, was already reading, socialist writing like a Marxism and things like that. So she might have been influenced by what he was exposed to as well. But it's really interesting how, I mean, instead of bringing wealth, bring new knowledge back home, right? And again, that's very kind of, could be problematic depending on how you read it too. But I don't know, but very possible.
Okay, if there isn't anything in the audience, I'll bring a question over to Saeyong. So you've brought forward several examples of Korean language authors who have engaged with oppressive periods in Korean history. Were there any barriers or disadvantages for authors who wanted to speak to these issues?
Yep. The main things that like have been coming up kind of through our questions is like the poverty and the not being able to be published. But I just remembered something. Your posterity is also influenced because remember, like Saeyong guy, like his works he just has more works, and his literary like posterity will remember him, even with like all the notes on the side about like what he did. But the second poet that you saw, the one whose birth date I'm so sorry Jung Ji-young got wrong, his death date is 1950, and there was a question mark there because we don't know what happened to him. He disappeared during the Korean War. And that is a tragedy, but it's also not as weird as the fact that when he disappeared, they couldn't tell if he'd been kidnapped or if he'd voluntarily gone to North Korea. So until 1988, when, actually going back, there was an embargo on like lists of people who you could not talk about or you could not mention and you could not publish because they were sympathizers. And so until 1988, when the embargo was lifted, they could not talk about him and they could not publish his work. If a scholar had to like say that like such and such was talking with this guy, then they would put like an X in the middle of his name. His name is 3 syllables, Chong Ji-yong. It would be Chong Yong. That's the level that you were at. And it can, because he was a literary giant already, he survived. But I am sure there are many, many, many poets whose like fame and like literary merit, reputation, their works simply have just been lost. And we are actually finding some new publications coming out of works of people who had been considered North Korean sympathizers. Their works had not been published, and their descendants are kind of suing to recover the reputations or get the government to it's not a pardon, but they apologize and say that you're not actually like what we charged you with. They're suing for that, and then when that happens, they generally do that together with a republished complete works of so and so.
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time. Yes. So I'd like to thank Ayaka and Saeyong for today's panel. Thank you. Thank you to all of you for coming.
Thank you.